Thanks very much. And it's such a delight to be asked back to talk at one of these conferences. I've been a viewer of these conferences for many iterations of it, so it's just such a privilege to be here. And it's really a privilege to be here as an alum of the MIDS program, and I thought I'd be remiss if I didn't share a little bit of my story into how I actually got into the MIDS program. As Jonathan mentioned, I've been a user experience researcher for about a decade. And what really drew me to the MIDS program is its positioning within the iSchool and the MIMS program and the PhD program that were already here. I could tell that there was already a drive to sort of combine this notion of design thinking and how we create the design of these products and bring data science into that. And that was really my passion as well. So it really, as expected, the MIDS program really set me up to explore this intersection between design thinking, UX, and data science. And I'm going to dive into a little bit of how that's been going for me and a little bit of a personal reflection on how I got into this and sort of where I might recommend others to go. But first, I need to set some context in line with the title of this talk. And that is that, when I tell people, hey, I'm a data scientist, but I started in UX research, the first thing I often hear is like, wow, you must love data visualization. And it's true. I do. Part of me wants to react like this. But part of me thinks that this seems just a little too familiar, because design has a history in working with developers and product of being regarded as the people who are making the pretty pictures. And where we actually get to strong experiences in design is when design is regarded as a partner on even footing with developer, with product managers, et cetera. So, in my experience, there's really sort of three areas, and visualization is definitely one of those areas where you can have a really strong data science design partnership. But for data visualization, I just emphasize it's a partnership. Don't go when the visualization is already done and you're saying, can you just make this look better, because it doesn't look better. Design as a partnership can help you think about what is the right visualization for what I'm trying to communicate and really kind of land it appropriately. But there's more to it than just that. Second area, which I'll touch on just briefly for the purpose of this talk, is the notion of designing machine learning experiences. And again, the key word here is that you need a little bit of partnership between your design group and your data scientists to be able to land this. It's not just about having the capabilities that are possible with machine learning and data science. It's about how do we land it in such a way so that the consumers can reap the benefit and feel comfortable doing so and empowered to actually use that data. There's a note earlier today from one of the speakers that data science is an important part, but it's just part of a larger system. And I think that resonates kind of with what I'm addressing here. Earlier in the year, Fast Companies has a design blog that they maintain, and they talked about the most important design jobs of the future. And to say that machine learning and data science had a huge impact on this list was sort of an understatement. I think the biggest one comes from Aaron Shapiro, who's the CEO of Huge, who basically comes straight out and says, look, there's going to be a machine learning designer in the future. And he talks about data, design, artificial intelligence all kind of blending together. I think there's more than that. I think you do need to have sort of a qualitative understanding of who your customers are to really kind of land this correctly. Ethics and the privacy concerns that come into play with working with this data so that users feel like they are comfortable and in control of how they understand how to act on that data is something that's also very important. If this interests you, please follow up with me after. This is something that I have a lot of interest in and I've done a lot of thinking about. But this isn't actually where I've had the most exploration since leaving the program. Actually, where I've had the most exploration is just thinking about a research-to-research partnership. Design is a pretty large discipline, and there's many facets, much like data science. There is design research, or some people call it user experience research, which is the role that I had prior to coming into the MIDS program. And so what I'm trying to take a look at is, how do I take this research, which tends to be qualitative, and combine it with what I'm learning in the data science program so that we can kind of have the best of these two disciplines working together towards the purpose of understanding human behavior. So I'm going to tell a brief story, and this story actually comes from before I was in the MIDS program, about why I'm really passionate about this, and just to kind of give you an idea of some of the nuance that's at play here. And then I've just got a few tips for you all in terms of, even if you're not going to be sort of a UX-centered data scientist or a UX researcher, how you might think about, as a data scientist, collaborating with UX researchers to kind of towards better outcomes for the work that you do. So first, the story. And the story is going to be about something that's kind of unexpected, which is just the save button. A little bit of background. So one of my first jobs at Microsoft was working on Visual Studio. For those who don't know, that's just an integrated development environment where programmers can spend a lot of time. We started with more of what's called the .NET languages, but we do support R and Python for you data scientists. Brief plug, last one I'll do. So that's, in 2010, though, one of the things that we were really looking at is we had been around for about 10 years at that point, that product. And as things happen, as a product kind of gets more and more entrenched, is there's a lot of complexity. And one of the things that we were really trying to do is take a look at how we could remove that complexity. And we were focused on the toolbar specifically. Now, the toolbar isn't necessarily very glamorous, but with developers, it really matters. Because the toolbar was taking about a line and a half worth of code every time we added another toolbar row to the interface. So developers always like to see as much of their code as we can, so there was really a clear trade-off that we could make if we could really push for the simplification. So this was a nice sort of data-oriented problem where we had plenty of usage data. Kind of going back to our keynote this morning, having the data wasn't the problem. It was that sort of step 2 where we were kind of in that question mark state of like, how do we get to the profit? So we had a lot of data to use and to leverage. And we had to start putting in some rules around, well, how are we going to make sort of data-informed decisions in order to decide how we're going to remove things from this toolbar, not make anybody upset, and kind of get to the end of this. So one way that we did this is by pursuing a reduction strategy of just taking a look at all up. How many people for a given command are using a keyboard shortcut? That we decided would be a pretty good signal to tell us that we could probably do away with that command and not have people be too upset. So just to kind of give you an idea, what we're looking at here is the relative frequency of a command and how frequently it's accessed via the mouse. And there's a transform on it, so we can more easily call out on the bottom ones that tend to be more oriented towards keyboard, and ones that tend to be more oriented towards the mouse are towards the top. So for example, new project is towards the top. Even if you aren't really a keyboard shortcut person, you probably know the keyboard shortcuts for copy and paste. They're consistent everywhere. So probably not surprising, those are ones that we said, you know, we could probably do away with those and be safe. So everything that was in the orange we decided would be a pretty good removal candidate. But what was interesting is that save is another one of those pretty common keyboard shortcuts, Control-S, you probably know it. But it wasn't used as frequently via the keyboard as we expected some of the other ones to be. So we kind of had a question going on in the back of our minds. So what we did from then is we created a prototype that would basically reduce the toolbars the way that we thought would be best, and we sent it out to a couple hundred customers. And we set up a survey, and we had 3 prompts in the survey that users could go through as many times as they wanted to. First one was kind of the first level of severity. Did you notice something was missing? Okay. Second one was a little bit worse. It's like, okay, would you customize it yourself to add that button back because you just feel really strongly about it? Okay, that's a little bit more severe. Third one is, would you file a bug if we shipped and we didn't have that button? Basically like, yes, we noticed it, and it's your fault. So this kind of set things up pretty well for us, and we put another rule in place, which basically was, you know, if we see people who are saying it's severe enough that they'd file a bug, okay, let's step back and kind of take a look at this. And not surprisingly, I mean, out of a couple hundred folks, we didn't see a huge blip for a lot of these folks, but we did see something along those lines where we had a few people notice some things. Yeah, they also said they would customize, and a few people were saying that they'd file a bug. So it was pretty in line with what we expected. But yet again, the save button tended to be a bit of an outlier. And there's a couple of things that are happening here. First of all, it was far and away the one that was noticed the most, which I guess didn't surprise me too much, given what we saw a little bit earlier. But the second thing, and this is what's really surprising from the point of view of a developer, is that not one of them pointed the finger back at us and said it was our fault. And the thing with developers is that you know, they tend to have this, because they do this all the time, they're building experiences for other people. So they tend to be really helpful and say, like, you know, I have a really good understanding of what you're trying to do here. They don't come with the problems, they come with the solutions. So to have this many people say something and not one of them say that, hey, there's a solution I want to bring back to you, that was a little weird. And so we were kind of at this conundrum, right? Because the rule I just told you said, if no one says they're going to file a bug, then we don't need to worry about it. But this is weird. So I did kind of worry about it. And I decided that the way to handle this is that we needed to actually talk to the respondents and interview them and kind of get a handle for what was going on. What I noticed is that respondents tended to have a little bit of a difficult time articulating their thoughts during the follow-up interviews. They would say things like, well, you know, now that you kind of put me into this, I mean, I guess I know the keyboard shortcut, and you're right. I mean, it is faster, and I guess it just makes sense. But maybe I'd still customize it because I just kind of like it that way, right? And that's so atypical, right? Like usually I'm used to talking to developers and hearing like, this is exactly the experience I want for you to create for me, and kind of having a lot of thought behind it. After talking to a number of them, we kind of realized that, you know, the desire to have that button there wasn't necessarily a logical one. There's just something about doing a lot of hard work and being able to press a button and see it depress and bounce back up, and see that the dirty indicator on your file has gone away, and you've sort of finished that bit of work. It feels good, right? It's a little bit of a reward cycle that happened, and we were kind of disrupting that in some way. So it was interesting because they weren't coming to us because, in some sense, because the rationale wasn't logical, it almost felt like from their perspective it wasn't defensible. But in reality, we think that that's a really important reason to keep that maintained. So we did decide that that usage of the save button was worth maintaining, and we ended up bringing it back. Now what's interesting is that despite kind of all the rules that we put in place, and all kind of the approach that we took of being data-driven from the usage data, in some sense, we would have never found this just relying on the data itself. In some sense, we actually needed the context of understanding kind of how people were approaching this problem and what really mattered to them in order to make the decision of how to work with this. So that's kind of what motivated me to join the program. And fast forward to 6 years where I've now finished the program last December. And I've started a team within the Microsoft Cloud UX team, and we're a team of what I'm calling UX data scientists. And I have our mission here, that we're trying to seek and share a deep contextual understanding around the quantitative data with the aim of reducing uncertainty around design decisions. And a lot of this, you know, as a data scientist, you can connect little bits to this, and there's elements from the prior talks as well in terms of experimentation and the experimentation culture that we have, and we're definitely plugging into that. But I think the main thing here is the contextual piece, because not only, yes, it is an important part of the data science work and that 80% that we're talking about, right? Like how do we truly understand the data that we're working with and unpack the context so that we're ready to actually do the modeling that we're going to do. But my argument is that when it comes to human behavior, I think it's a lot harder than we give it credit for. And it's a lot harder to actually unpack the context and the meaning just if we're just going to sit there and look at the data and never go outside and actually talk to people. So but the bottom line is that my team exists because I just believe part of understanding human behavior in the product is richer and more actionable when we take the background of UX research and the background of data scientists and kind of bring them together. And so I urge the data scientists who are thinking about reasoning on human behavior with data, seek out your UX research counterparts and learn from them. And I think your outcomes will be improved as a result. And to that end, I have a few tips that we've sort of been putting into practice at Microsoft that I think will help with the interaction. So the first one is to overcome the lexicon barrier. As data scientists, we often think and communicate in attributes or features and the models that we're building on top of those. But that isn't really how UX researchers are trained to think. They're trained to observe people with what they're doing and relay the richness of the story back in terms of qualitative data. So, and they also focus on the scenarios that make up the experience. So it's a little bit of sort of they're trading in different currencies, so to speak. And so one thing, just to give you an example from the UX research perspective, is we tend to do something that's called creating personas, design personas. Design personas are, well, personas have existed for a while in the business space. Marketing uses them a lot to decide like who's the kind of person, the archetypal person that we're selling to. Design personas were kind of a spin on that were developed by Alan Cooper in his book from the 90s, I think, The Inmates Are Running the Asylum. And this is great. You know, if you want a reference on this, this article is actually a great current one from the Cooper's blog about the process that they're kind of continuing to evolve, and they're putting it in place with a course that you can take online about how to create personas. But the goal of a persona, fundamentally, is to reduce that uncertainty by having these set of archetypal users and telling their stories based on what we've learned by observing them, shadowing them, and surveying them to get kind of a broader view of who they are. they are fundamentally story pieces. They talk about the user's goals, their pain points. What is a day in the life like trying to accomplish the goals of a particular product if I don't have that product in place? What are some of the difficulties that I encounter? And so the aim is to cultivate this empathy so that everyone who is working on this product is on the same page about like what's important in the sort of human aspect of this. So what I've noticed on the design side, and this is something that I've kind of worked with my team to correct, is that we're really good about telling those stories and the richness. But personas, it's usually not one persona per product. It's usually a set. And I've noticed that we don't spend a lot of time talking about what are those differentiating features or attributes that divide these personas in a meaningful way. And so I've really pushed my team, the UX research team that I partner with, to say, what are these attributes? And let's start having a conversation about them. Because if we can bring that into the mix for how we understand some of the big data, the usage data that we look at, we can be more informed. So, and I think that this is pretty important. Getting to these attributes is a little bit tricky. But there's a quick activity that I can do to kind of show what I'm talking about here. So just really quickly, mid-students in the audience, can you raise your hands? Awesome. And then if you're keep them up. But then if you're a developer currently or in the past, leave your hand up. Otherwise, put it down. OK, so we lost about 60%. You can put your hands on, thanks. Lost about 60% of those hands with that. So about 40% developers, the rest not. So if I wanted to design a tool for data scientists, whether or not someone had a developer background probably makes a difference, because you spend a lot of your time programming, right? So that would be one example of an attribute that is really meaningful in this context. So I try to kind of cultivate these conversations about what are some of the data points that we can bring in. In order to do that, I find something, and this is something that I borrowed from the Capstone course. For those of you who are in Capstone, you talk a little bit about the notion of a product manager and how they have to bring in UX technical concerns and business concerns all together. I've borrowed this model and used it to sort of talk a little bit about attributes. And the idea here is that when we're kind of taking that first step that we heard about in the keynote this morning about trying to bring the data together, I try to force these conversations about what are some hypotheses that we want to have in terms of making sure we have the data to answer the types of questions that we want to have. Do we tend to have the technology attributes on hand? Usually we do. We're pretty good about collecting things like browser information, the operating system that folks are on, et cetera. Do we usually have the attributes to be able to reason and talk about whether or not people are giving us money, converting, maximizing our KPIs? We tend to, because that's, if we don't have that information, then we can't really tell if we're doing a good job from a business perspective. So that's pretty critical. But from the experience attributes perspective, I argue that that's one of those things that is both simultaneously harder to get at and harder to integrate into the story, and also often not as commonly thought of. Because when you're sitting there, for example, as a developer trying to think about what data do I want to bring in and collect as part of understanding how this product is used, you may not be thinking about it from that UX perspective. But it's challenging to actually get at some of that data. I mean, it would be hard for me to be able to say just by how you're using a product whether or not you had a programming background. Which leads me to tip number 2, which is partnering on the data. And this is probably a pyramid that you've seen before, a little bit generalized. Instead of knowledge and wisdom on the top, I just put insights. That's a common simplification I do when I kind of share this around Microsoft. And what I notice is that typically we have folks who are partnering on the insights. So one example of this is what we call triangulation in UX research, where I'll run a study and I'll talk to 5 users, and just to get an idea of where some of the pitfalls are in terms of using this data. And I say, oh, there's this issue. I'll go to a data scientist and say, data scientist, will you please tell me how many people have also encountered this issue? And that's great. It's better that you do that than not do it. But my argument is that we can get to some richer discussions if we just push the collaboration a little bit further down the pyramid and say, like, have some conversations about what data we're interested in collecting and how we can kind of bring together on that. And again, the goal here to keep in mind is that the story richness that we have from UX research, if we can get that in with the data, then I think our models can be more expressive and more representative of the actual motivation behind human behavior. One approach to this, and I have to give a nod to Carrie Rodden, who is from Google, who developed something called the HEART framework. You may have heard of it, or you may not have, but it's definitely a good read if you're interested at all in combining data science and UX. The idea here is that she gives you a framework of thinking about some of the different approaches for collecting UX metrics. And some of them are pretty straightforward. I mean, like adoption and retention, those are pretty standard, right? But she also brings in this notion of happiness, which is, trying to think about something that's a little bit more satisfaction-oriented, a little bit more subjective rather than just the hard numbers. But what's especially interesting here is her notion of goals, signals, and metrics, right? So I have a goal to understand whether or not, at building a data science tool, you have a programming background. That metric is hard to get. So that piece in the middle, that signal, is what we use to start a lot of discussions at Microsoft to say that we have these goals to understand something in a particular way. We may not have exactly that metric, but what is a signal we can use? Expertise, product expertise is one that's really good on this, right? Because even if we could ask every user of a product, are you an expert in this product? We wouldn't necessarily trust that data because people have different definitions of what expertise means. So having this conversation around what is the signal that's going to indicate to us that someone's an expert is really helpful. So some strategies for collaborating on the data. One is agreeing on the signals for those key experience attributes. So having the discussion so that we can kind of set a common expectation across the teams. Second one is triangulating usage patterns rather than the isolated issues. I talked about sort of looking at isolated issues, but I'm more interested in seeing, hey, when this user encountered this issue, this was what they were doing in the product. This is a broader usage pattern. And do people have that usage pattern? And what else can we learn about people who have that usage pattern? And the last one is surveying users in product so that when we start collecting information like, do you have a programming background, we can tie it to all of the usage data directly and start building sort of more representative models for user behavior. The last tip that I'll touch on just very briefly is just connecting on the notion of uncertainty. This is one that I'm just thinking a little bit about, and I'm sort of noticing that we need to kind of bring uncertainty a little bit more into the mix. With some of the discussions that I'm having and collaborations with data scientists. So I'll just give you a couple of areas for exploration to think about, and that's kind of as far as I've taken this. So one is disclosing and discussing assumptions, and this is something that's come up in some previous talks already today, right? So I think that cultivating a culture for your data around transparency and sort of disclosing your assumptions it crafts the right kind of culture where UX research and data science feel like they can kind of have an even seat at the table. So I think that that's sort of an important step that I'm encouraging my team to do as an example. The second one is exploring the context of outliers in relation to the experience attributes. A common step for us is to say, oh, this looks like an outlier and doesn't really fit, and let's just ignore it to build kind of a different model that fits a little bit better because they're just so out of the ordinary. The outliers are potentially something that can provide a really rich story, or maybe not. Not all outliers are going to have a rich story behind them, but an outlier could be indicative of a different type of usage pattern that's worth looking into. So collaborating on areas where we think there's some uncertainty can provide some insight that can improve the product. And then the last one is, this is just a nod to a prior talk at this conference a couple years ago. The head of data science from Airbnb talked a little bit about doing experimentations and specifically A/B tests. And she said, it's important to check for those treatment effects afterwards to know, for example, if a browser is causing a particular issue. So I extend that call and say that A/B testing in a culture of experimentation can really help, but that doesn't provide the full amount of context behind the drivers of the behavior, even if you got an increase in the KPI. So it's important to check for those treatment effects. So my tips are to overcome the lexicon barrier. Just reach out and have a conversation with UX researchers. I guarantee you they want to have a conversation with you. But there's a pretty big barrier on their side, too, because the language that data scientists use is kind of hard to get over. Partner on the data, not just on the insights. Don't just throw insights over the wall, because that helps. But I think that you can get deeper in terms of your understanding. And in times of uncertainty, connect with each other to try and see what you can learn from each other about that type of uncertainty. And with that, I will take questions. Thank you.
Yeah, so you talked about, you mentioned words personas and archetypes.
Yep.
We just went through a exercise at our company where we started off thinking we want to do personas, and that was deemed to be like not data-driven, and in the end, we came up with this idea that they're going to be called archetypes because they were data-driven. And I don't know if like that's a terminology that you use, or maybe you could speak to that, or is it the same and we're just using different words for the same thing?
Maybe. So personas have kind of a long and challenging history where some people have a bad experience with personas, and that informs a lot of the discussion. So let me just say two things to your question. One is I've heard people say that personas are not data-driven because they're not based on product data, they're based on interviews, and they're based on survey. And I just want to clarify that qualitative data is still data. Even though we aren't talking about big data, it still is a form of data. I don't think that's your situation necessarily, but I just want to kind of lay that groundwork there. I think it is probably a terminology difference. Personas, as they're defined, are meant to be based on that kind of thing. And in my mind, I mean, the definition of a persona, according to Alan Cooper, is that they're archetypal users. So they should be the same, but there's kind of a little bit of a difference. There's an interesting, SIGCHI is the ACM special interest group around computer-human interaction. Their conference, I believe, in 2015 had a paper about building personas completely off of usage data, which I'm still a little on the fence about. I think it's interesting to look at the clustering of workflows as they happen in usage, but sometimes you want a persona for a user who isn't currently coming to your product, and you lose that data if you're only focused on the usage data.
Okay. Questions? Joseph, right in the front here. Thanks, Ben.
Hey. So I guess I'm kind of curious about what context would maybe the most benefit from interaction between data scientists and UX folks. Like, it might not be a problem, unless you would encourage that, like, for every single assignment, a data scientist seek out a UX person.
Sure, not necessarily. I mean, I think, first of all, if your data science work is, there's a lot of data science work that doesn't necessarily touch on the user interface or talk about behavioral, so I do kind of like rule those out. But even if you are sort of focused on like the design of the products exclusively, I take a prioritization approach. So for example, my team is kind of in between. Like, I've hired data scientists who have some sort of UX affinity. And when it comes to triangulation, like I mentioned, we have my UX researchers who sit with us come to us all the time and say, hey, you know, these are the issues that I find. And I try to set a little bit of a bar to say, what are the higher priority issues? Because we have investigations that we're doing on our own. And ultimately, at some point, we want to try and help each other. But I think the bigger context is, what are the hypotheses that I'm learning and that my team is learning that ultimately we're acknowledging can probably best be answered by qualitative research, and vice versa, and stop trying to do each other's work sort of with suboptimal methods. So that's, we take a prioritization approach, not everything necessarily.
Thanks.
Yep.
Okay. Other questions for Sam? Before you're going to turn around there, Ben. Let's go straight back there.
For someone who's not necessarily in a field where like there are where UX folks don't abound,
yeah.
How would you recommend trying to make contact, or maybe like reaching past barriers of established work?
Sure. I think it's a tough one. I think that my perspective from the UX research side of this, so I gave a similar talk at UXPA, which is sort of a yearly UX research conference. And the perspective that I have there is that I think on both sides the desire is there a little bit, but from their perspective, the knowledge gap seems more insurmountable than it probably does in our direction going into UX research. So I would say just don't hesitate and just start the conversation, even if there aren't that many there, because I guarantee like people are just generally thinking about it and it's in the back of their mind. But if you look at average UX research conferences, there's not a lot of talks about data science because they just don't have they don't know, right? They don't know how to engage. I'm trying to just get people to start those conversations and see what the right engagement model is. I have some ideas, obviously, but I think more will come out over time. So,
Thanks again.
yeah, you bet.
Sam, who invites who into conversations, typically?
So before I kind of really started pushing this, I found no one invited anyone into conversations. I make a really big point of it just because I think it's important, but I think if I can generalize for a second, right? Like on the UX research side, I think it's an issue, like I said, of sort of the lexicon barrier feeling too insurmountable. There are data scientists, not in this room, of course, but the promise of data science ostensibly is that we can answer all the questions we have with all this data at our disposal. So I think from the data science perspective, the notion that I would need to reach out to someone who has a different perspective on the data may not occur to them. And so I'm just trying to sort of raise that issue a little bit and kind of encourage the dialogue, so to speak.
You got it. Thanks. Perspectives. Okay, yeah, Madison right in the front here. Oh, good.
Oh, cool.
Okay, we'll go there. Madison, you're going to be next.
Hello.
Hey.
Yeah, I just had a statement, so
Sure.
not a question, but we've been doing reports and data analysis for a number of our clients who are in the pharma life science industry. I just wanted to validate the impact of UX on adoption of reports and actionable insights is significant. I'll give you an instance where we did the same report with numbers, and then we did it with graphs, and then we did it with UX team. And the adoption impact moved from 5% to 20% to 78%. Just because of UX. And these are sales reports, which talks about the money the sales guy gets.
Yeah.
So just to give you an impact, same thing applies with CXO levels. The way the companies work, how they're functioning, the numbers get lost. The UX, the experience of who's looking at it, is very important. So it's not just about design, it's about actually creating the personas and understanding the person and the person's background, if it's a finance guy versus a sales guy versus an R&D guy. So it makes a significant impact. Just wanted to make
thanks
that
very
statement.
much for that. And I'll also add just the storytelling piece of it a little bit as well. I think that when you're talking about, we have the numbers, we have the visualizations, but it's really the UX that kind of helped. There's a storytelling aspect to it where we know kind of how to bring it all together, and I think that's an important step. So thanks.
I kind of was going to say the same thing, how relevant this is, because we actually just went through this at work, where we had a data science team and we had our UX designers, and no one ever talked. And I joined after everything started a year before me. And I was like, why is no one talking to anyone? So
That's a great question.
So I went down to the other phone, like, hey guys, and we started a dialogue, and now things are really coming together. And when everyone works together, it's amazing the impact it can have. So I'm just saying, this is super relevant. I hope everyone's paying attention.
Thanks, I appreciate
it's so
that.
important.
Yeah, even if it's awkward, like go have an awkward conversation.
Right.
And if you find something, like first of all, there are data science and UX wide, like there are no conference or not very many talks where we talk about one and the other and vice versa. So if you have it in a success story, get up and share it, publish it, write about it, share it, because there are people like me and like you who are trying to find ways to make this happen, and there just aren't a lot of examples out there. So be vocal, and please share with me. Feel free to email me. My email's on there for a reason. If you have examples or stories, I'm always, I have a long-running collection, so please reach out.
Okay. Yeah, we've got a couple of questions just on this slide here.
Sure.
Thank you. Thanks.
Interesting presentation. Thank you.
you.
I'm just wondering, how do you came up with a good research question or hypothesis for your user experience? For example, the save button, how you came up with the idea that you want to figure out, shorten the button?
Yeah. So save button in particular, that was a tricky one just because, first of all, I didn't have the benefit of having, the MIDS program, I'm really not trying to make a sales pitch here, but the MIDS program really did shift my thinking in terms of how I think about data, both qualitative and quantitative. But at the time, I didn't really have a formal hypothesis. I just knew that something was kind of weird. And I just kept pursuing that until I had a good understanding that kind of satisfied me. And ultimately, I had to kind of break out of the quantitative data and actually have some conversations with folks. In terms of hypotheses, I think what we're trying to do now is shift, especially part of being data-driven. We're trying to build this hypothesis culture. It's embedded in a lot of the lean process documents of, if we're going to make a change, let's have a hypothesis about how it's going to change. And we just have a lot of conversations about what is the desired impact you want to have on customers by doing this change in the first place. and forcing the discussion, and which is always really awkward, especially if you're at the beginning of the experimentation culture, of by how much do you think it's going to change? And they're like, well, I have no idea how much it's going to change. But it's an important step to take to at least put yourself out there to start encouraging that experimentation culture and then start to know, okay, we've tried this a few times and we know we're not going to see gains this big, but we have to kind of expect that they'll be a little bit smaller. So yeah, having those conversations.
Let's go 2 rows back from there. Thank you.
I had a question about your beliefs about the uses of inductive versus deductive reasoning when in UX.
Yeah.
So how do you think they should be applied? Should the data be driving the hypothesis? Should the hypothesis be driving the data? What are your thoughts on this?
I think it really depends on I think you can put some rules in place around it should always go this way, but I find that the theory doesn't really align to the opportunities that we have in industry. So I think it's kind of whoever gets there first tends to have some sort of exploration around it. And rather than saying we should start from one approach versus start from another approach, I'm saying start from one approach and know the strengths and limitations of that approach and know when and how to engage with the other side to kind of round out your understanding of what's happening from a UX perspective.
Does one of them end up getting used more in your work than the other?
So being on a UX research, it tends to be a little bit more deductive and more the notion of grounded theory to kind of another way of putting that is kind of like qualitative saturation, right? Like going out and understanding. We've talked to a few people. Do we think that we have a good qualitative saturation of understanding who these people are? Do we need to talk to another set of folks? So I do think it aligns to the background in the industry that you have, which isn't necessarily the right way. Part of why my team is there is to kind of say, let's not just have 2 teams doing their own thing, but let's bring them together a little bit more of a mixed methods approach.
Okay, great. Time for a final question. Anyone? All right. Please join me in thanking Sam.
Thanks
very much.